I'll turn it over to Alberto.
Thank you very much, Marina, and welcome once again, everybody, for helping us plan what we anticipate would be Orange County's growth for the next 30 years. As we started this engagement back in December of 2020, when we talked about that macro scale, as Marina defined them, the planning areas, market areas, very specific about identifying the diversity of the county. It is a real fundamental perspective and approach to really understand that diversity and its character is the foundation of this overall initiative. How to plan within those specific opportunities, and how to be a little bit more assertive as to what would be anticipated to happen adjacent to your neighborhoods or within your neighborhoods and within your communities. So thank you again for being with us tonight. I cannot emphasize enough the difference between the way that we have been planning for the last decades in Orange County and the way that this new strategy, new lens of growth and how to visualize interaction and intervention in the existing context, urban context, suburban context, and rural context of Orange County will continue to be planned for and evolve. So thank you again for your time tonight. As we move forward into today's topic, again, great introduction by Marina about the sectors, and which is we in the planning division, we look at it as the vision map, those areas that are going to have a specific delineation, but the way that they are delineated are not regulatory. They are really areas where we can anticipate the level of change or maintenance of existing character that may happen. And when we speak about place types, those would be, as Matt will also explain further, our new reference to future land use designations. In other words, we would describe the intended character of those specific, much more specific areas, the mix of uses, the level of densities and intensities, and the type of places that they will become. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over again to Matt, who will continue the presentation. But before that, I'll just like to acknowledge that we have District 6 with us today, representatives from the district office. Rose Nancy is with us tonight, and I would like to welcome her. Commissioner Siplin may be listening, and there may be others that join throughout the program tonight. So we'll acknowledge them as soon as we're notified that they're here. So thank you very much, and Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Alberto. If you watched the last series of presentations, if you haven't, please do. A lot was covered. Many complex topics. They were addressed to frame the importance of a comprehensive plan. Much of the public may not know what a comprehensive plan is. Many don't interact with it on a daily basis. But there are many topics covered and that were covered in the last series of town hall meetings, such as how much the county will grow, the generational dynamics of growth and aging, the formats growth may occur in, what affects housing affordability, and whether people have transportation options, where some places are more connected to regional transportation than others, new mobility technologies and the current state of planning, how zoning works with the comprehensive plan, and so on. Quite a lot must be considered when developing a vision that looks forward 30 years. And 30 years is quite a long time. If we jump back 6 jumps at 30 years, we're in 1840. That's when sewing machines hit the street there on the bottom left. The last 30 years took us from early personal computers in homes, homes that could afford them, that is, to advanced computers in most people's pockets, on our wrists and our cars, and managing autonomous rovers on Mars. Where will we go in the next 30 years? Comprehensive plans are designed to look towards a distant future and to align all the policies and activities of the county towards a shared future vision. Orange County is a hotbed of innovation and home to diverse and growing population. As we look at growth management, we have to consider how to grow while protecting sensitive natural lands and the county's rural heritage, to grow in ways that increase equity and affordability, mobility options and access to jobs, and places for friends, family, and fun. As a reminder, the current comprehensive plan was adopted in 2009. There's a lot of stuff in there, of course. These plans are big. And the Vision 2050 plan will also have a lot of content. Today, we're going to focus on growth and development policies and the way that Vision 2050 leads the county forward towards a future vision, rather than being reactionary in the way that often comprehensive plans in the past have been. So we're looking to direct and create a vision through this process. Now, a major component of growth, of course, is the projection of population. This was covered in the last series, but I wanted to bring it back up again because the county clearly has been growing steadily, as shown in this chart, for quite a time. And just like in the end on the right side, we have this cone of uncertainty, just like the hurricane cone of uncertainty. The exact future is uncertain, but we know the general path, which leads towards quite a significant growth in the future, whether you're on the lower or high end of that. But the midpoint here, 690,000 people in addition in the next 30 years. So 690,000 is quite a lot. That's a lot of new neighbors, a good way to think about it. The city of Orlando, for reference, has a population of 280,000 people approximately. So the county will most likely grow by 2.5 times the population of the city of Orlando. Now, to think that growth would occur evenly across the whole county is bad planning. And to allow that to allow the growth to take this form would be bad policy, resulting in a degraded quality of life by increasing driving, increasing the cost of infrastructure and the tax burden that's associated with it, and reducing rural and natural lands. So I hope we can agree that these are not desirable outcomes. So we plan in order to direct growth to specific places, not everywhere. One of the two components of growth management here is sectors. Sectors direct growth to where it's encouraged. We also plan in order to direct the character of new development in those places where growth is desirable. When we consider the county as a whole, it's quite a diverse place, and it should continue to offer people a diversity of options for where to live, diverse job opportunities and educational choices, and diverse ways to get around. Place types direct the character of future growth through form, intensity, and the mix of uses and mobility. Sectors are large, and place types fall within them. Together, these direct growth towards a future vision. Where growth occurs and the character that it takes is a key component of Vision 2050. These live in the future land use component of the comprehensive plan. Sectors determine where growth will occur, and place types determine the form that growth will take. We're spending a lot of time today on these two components, mainly because most people don't interact with the comprehensive plan or with future land use as discussed previously. We hope the Vision 2050 document is one that everyone can understand, that you can contribute to the vision and build expectations for what the future will be. But there's a larger overall picture that sectors and place types fit into. There's terminology used, and we just wanted to go over this so that you're familiar with the terminology as it's discussed throughout this whole process. Some of the elements that we discuss are policy, while others are not. At the top, they're the incorporated municipalities. These are places that determine their own growth policies. Below that are the market areas. These were discussed in the prior meeting, and Alberto talked about those just a few moments ago. These are really a tool that allows us to zoom in on parts of the county that have different characteristics, analyze those places, engage with people who live and work there, and to consider how policies should react to different contexts. Next is the urban service area. This kind of interacts with the other one. They're not mutually exclusive, but this is a policy boundary that determines where utility service will be offered. Indirectly, this is a growth policy in that it limits where growth can occur from an urban versus rural standpoint. But the following three elements, the subjects of this and the following town hall, work together to control the intensity and form of growth. Today, we'll look at sectors and place types, as mentioned. In the next town hall series, we'll look at Orange Code, the zoning code update. So let's get started with sectors. Remember, the sectors determine where growth can occur. They also determine the amount of growth in each area through place types. As Alberto stated, they're not regulatory, but they direct the allocation of place types. So technically, they're intended to limit which place types are applicable, place types being the new future land use categories in different areas. We'll look at these after the sectors, specifically the place types. But to understand sectors, I think it's best to think about those directing where growth should occur. In Vision 2050, there are 6 sectors on the left. And as a reminder, off on the right side, the incorporated areas are not included in sectors because municipalities manage their own growth. So at the top is the targeted sector. These are the growth priority areas. Following this is the intended sector, where existing area-wide plans have been developed and where existing plan developments have been approved and entitled prior to today. These 2 sectors are where nearly all future growth is directed. Following are the established and rural sectors, aimed at retaining their current character, and then the preserved sector for large and contiguous preserved natural areas. And at the bottom is the special sector for more complicated land uses like power plants, water treatment, airports, universities, these places that have non-typical characteristics and need special consideration and rules that are different from, say, normative development patterns. So in terms of land area, this is how things break down. The vast majority of the county overall is within the preserved, rural, and established sectors where significant growth is discouraged. Instead, growth is directed to the targeted and intended sectors, roughly 12% of the county. So in chart format, this is how it looks. Incorporated areas and road rights-of-way occupy quite a large amount of the county. And we put road rights-of-way in there because we're looking at these designations from a sort of parcel level. So we take the roads out and they add up to a lot of land. But we put them there with incorporated areas because the sectors don't exactly apply to those. Yet the preserved and rural sectors take up more land than both the incorporated areas and roads. The areas prioritized for development in the targeted and intended sectors, they remain a small percentage. So now we're going to take a closer look at each sector. First, the areas where significant growth is discouraged, and then the areas where growth is encouraged. Here's a map of the whole county. We'll see how sectors are mapped at the countywide level, and then zoom into the South Market area for a closer look. Of course, note that we're not marking out every municipality and every little detail here. The roads and the cities and the airport and so forth that are listed on here for orientation purposes. So incorporated areas cover about 24% of the county. As I mentioned, these areas manage their own growth policies. Sectors apply to the unincorporated areas only. First is the preserved sector. This is the simplest of all. These are lands currently in preservation or with policies directing for future preservation. The sector only includes large and contiguous areas in preservation. There's many developments that have smaller additional conservation easements and conservation areas, and they're not in the sector because they're small and sprinkled sort of everywhere, and the sector is really about these large areas of preservation. So here is that sector mapped on the county level, and I'll note that we're going to dive into the market area specifically following this. So right now we're just looking across the county. This sector is about 21% of the land in the county. The rural sector includes lands in agricultural use, pasture land, rural settlements, and large undeveloped lands where growth is discouraged, and also natural areas that are not yet in preservation. So this is the rural sector mapped. Like the preserved sector, the rural sector covers about 21% of the county. It's funny they work out to be the same. Now the established sector, this includes most of the county's residential areas where the goal is to maintain the current character. Here's the established sector mapped. These are residential areas principally surrounding and between incorporated areas. The established sector includes about 13% of the county. When we add these three together, you can clearly see the areas where growth is discouraged, comprising 55% of the county overall. So if you have kids, I have a 6-year-old, and if you spend a lot of time around them, maybe you've been familiar with this mantra around managing healthy eating called go slow and whoa, that encourages kids to eat lots of healthy foods, that's the go, not to eat too many processed foods, the slow, and to very rarely eat sweets and treats, the whoa. So we can look at the sector map in the same light, with whoa areas where we want to discourage growth, like the preserved and rural sectors, slow areas like the established sector, and next we'll look at the go areas for growth. The intended sector includes areas that have already been planned for new growth, including entitled planned developments and area-wide plans. This sector represents about 5.5% of the county and includes areas like Horizon West, Innovation Way, and Lake Pickett. And lastly, the targeted sector, where most new growth will be encouraged. This sector includes existing commercial, industrial, and higher density residential land located along the county's major roadway network and areas along its future planned transit routes. This is the targeted sector mapped, representing about 6% of the county. The targeted sector is heavily concentrated in the I-4 corridor and the South Industrial area, but it's also found along major roadways leading to incorporated areas. You'll see that it's up there on OBT between Orlando and Apopka, and also the major roads heading between the existing incorporated areas. Together, between the intended and the targeted sectors, these are about 11.5% of the county, and these are the areas that growth is encouraged in the future. And to fill the gap, there's the special sector. Remember, I mentioned with some special rules, but it's a small amount of the county overall, 3.5%. It includes places like UCF, the power plant and prison, the golf center, and other special places that are not housing and commercial and the things that we normally think about in terms of growth. So when we put these together, we end up with a sector map covering all of the county. It's hard to read individually here, so that's why we split them out to look at them each, and now you can understand better how they lay together. This map directs where growth will occur and how much growth should occur in a given area. Or from a go, slow, whoa standpoint, it looks like this. So now let's look at the Northwest market area and see how the sectors are mapped over here. Now, quite a lot of the market area falls within unincorporated municipalities. While this is only 30%, when you take away Lake Apopka and Wekiwa Springs, the incorporated area covers actually over 54% of the areas that are not in preservation. So while it's 30%, it's still most of basically half of the land that's not in preservation within this sector. Here are those preserved areas comprising 42% of the market area, covering the lake and the state park. The rural sector here occupies the northwest of the Northwest market area, up there in the corner, with a few other areas in the lower right, retaining some separation between Apopka and Ocoee, and some little pieces here and there in between the incorporated areas. And then the established sector. This covers already developed areas within the incorporated areas as well as at their edges. So zooming in, because it's kind of hard to read all these little pieces on the map, you can see the pattern of annexation here is pretty strange. And this illustrates how the established sector fills in the holes that are there in the incorporated areas. Though the largest contiguous established areas are along the eastern edge of the market area, most substantially below the state park. Now, the collective no and low growth sectors make up 64.5% of the Northwest market area. Together, the incorporated areas and the no low growth sectors comprise about 94.5% of the market area. I mean, basically everything, nearly the whole thing. From the perspective of unincorporated county land, most of the area is intended for preservation of the current character. But there are some growth areas. This is the intended sector, which includes 2 special areas at the edge of the market area where new growth is already in process or has been approved. It's about 1% of the overall market area. And the targeted sector is here. You can barely make it out in the map, but if you zoom in, just like the established, you can see it a little more clearly. These are mostly commercial properties located along major roadways, like Silver Star and Hiawassee at the right side of the zoom in here. There are a few of these areas within the adjacent incorporated areas, totaling less than 1% of the market area. I think at the moment it's 0.8%. So in all, both the targeted and intended sectors comprise less than 2% of the entire market area of the Northwest. So not much growth is intended within unincorporated county land here. Of course, growth may still occur within incorporated areas though. Those are not within the jurisdiction of the county's comprehensive plan to manage. So keep that in mind since they take up quite a lot of the land in this area. And going back to the go slow whoa standpoint, here's how the sector map breaks down in this market area. And I'll note that the missing numbers on the right are the special sector, road rights of way. But in all, this shows that very little go is happening in this area and a whole lot of whoa here. So again, from a sector standpoint, this is the composite sector map. I hope this provides a strong understanding of sectors. The next topic we're going to get into is place types, and sectors influence place types, which we'll clarify for you. But before we move on, we'd like to see if there are any questions from attendees or viewers, items that the county or consultant team would like to add. Marina?
Thank you, Matt. So I have a question for you. It's clear that the targeted and the intended sectors where growth is directed. That's obvious. And the established sector is described as areas that will maintain. However, a small amount of change is still anticipated in these areas. A subtle change, gentle change. Can you maybe describe a little bit what that change could look like, or what that change, what kind of changes are envisioned in the established areas? Because I would imagine that that's where there's a lot of where there could potentially be some concern.
Yeah, certainly. The established areas, they're not all entirely built out. For example, for the most part, they tend to be single-family subdivisions, schools, some religious institutions mixed in there. There's also some townhouses and multifamily. There's also lands that have not been developed, say 5-acre parcels. What the established sector does is sets a goal that any development, any growth in these areas would maintain the character of the existing area, so not be different from what's already there. So those 5-acre parcels, 2-acre parcels here and there, those might develop. The property owners have a right to build on those properties. But what the established sector is doing is it's not targeting those for significant intensification beyond what's around them. So the goal is to be like what is around them, and not to be so different. And we'll see when we look in detail in place types that occur within the targeted sector, that those place types are intended for more intensive activity and use.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to describe the established sector as areas that won't change, but that will accommodate, that can be made to be more efficient, where the infill opportunities can fill in, but the overall character is sort of still established.
And that's why we call them slow too. I just wanted to remind, we said there's slow growth in here as that growth may still occur, but when you think about fast growth, you probably think about larger developments that are the type that fit into the targeted sector. When you're seeing bigger buildings and so forth, the slow growth is sort of the natural molt and change. People may rebuild houses or do small things at a slow pace, and so that's the intention there.
Great. And so now I'm going to ask you another question, which has to do with the sectors, which is a new scale of planning, I guess one could describe it. And you've mentioned, Alberto's mentioned that these are regulatory, but maybe you can spend a little bit of time to say they're not regulatory. Sorry, to explain why they are, this scale of planning is still necessary, and why not jump straight to just the FLU or the future land use.
Sure. Well, the goal here is to get beyond the parcel by parcel level look at land use. And so if you look at the older versions of future land use, what's there currently, what's been there in the past, what is the old way of doing things that a lot of people have followed, the future land use tends to be reactionary. Somebody wants to change the use of land, so they go through a process of changing the future land use. So it doesn't actually predict anything. And when you only look at a parcel by parcel level, you can't create places together. You just get land uses, like a lot of commercial buildings strung along a major rural roadway. That doesn't really make a place, but it is a land use. So we want to zoom out from there to start making places. Now the place types do that from a regulatory standpoint as land use. They look at a larger area, but what the sectors are intended to do is to help understand where certain place types should be used. So it's kind of like a two-scale system in terms of defining the character and future growth in an area. If we didn't have the sectors, then who's to say that a very intensive land use might come to the rural area, for example. The sectors help us to allocate where certain types of land uses and place types are appropriate.
That's right. Alberto, do you have anything you want to add to that, or should we move on to another question?
Sure, just a quick follow-up, Marina, thank you. Just to focus also, as we discuss sectors, is that they begin to not only better define the character of those general areas into the level of densities, intensities that those particular areas may begin to receive growth. But also I think that and the specifics of those densities and intensities is what's about to be presented with the place types. But one area that I think it's interesting to elaborate a little bit more, and I think when the presentation of the market area was introduced, we were able to bundle unincorporated areas and roads as that very large piece of the pie, if you would, that basically is untouched and will pretty much accumulate that very large amount of area. But I think I just want to clarify, and maybe throughout the presentation we can continue to elaborate and define the fact that with this planning approach, we are beginning to think of roads and the corridors a little bit differently. I mean, they almost as a future land use designation area when we speak about corridors, because the character, the environment, and the associated land uses that define that outdoor room is really critical and important. And as Matt described, we're no longer just parcel based by parcel based when we discuss and define the policies for each one of those future land use designations. But now we're taking into consideration the public realm, that outdoor environment that used to not have a future land use in the past. So just food for thought.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think it also helps to help justify or prioritize capital investment for transit and other sort of amenities that could do sort of the greatest good for people around the county. And I know Matt will address that further as we get into the place types. Two quick questions for you, Alberto. There's one question, someone's asking the Pine Hill area. We have to let them know that's in the core area, and that'll be shown tomorrow. So please tune in for tomorrow's session. But one question, Alberto says, it looks like the JPA with Mount Dora has been expanded back out to its original boundaries. That area was reduced during Rich Crotty's administration, wasn't it? Does that ring a bell for you?
Yeah, the joint planning agreement with Mount Dora will stay pretty much status quo. We will continue to coordinate with the different municipalities that the county has joint planning agreements, and we will continue to, make the necessary modification and adjustments. But what it is, the boundary that it is today will pretty much, is not anticipated to change at this particular time. As we continue and engage this effort all the way through, the summer, we will continue to look at the specifics. But as far as the specific joint planning agreements and the structure of it will stay pretty much the same.
They remain intact. Okay, and so another place-specific question for you, Alberto. South of State Road 528, east of Narcosi Road, Deseret land has many new tollways. The county has this area defined as rural future. There is a big disconnect between what the 2050 plan is proposing versus what CFX is planning. And is the county going to try to stop that?
I think we will continue to better understand the corridor plans that are being proposed by the different entities that are working on those corridor plans, the north-south corridor and the east-west corridor that are currently planned for in that rural east market area, south of 528 or even 50 and 520 in that general area where Deseret Ranch lands today. So we will continue to work extremely closely with not only with our transportation planning division to continue to evaluate those regional proposals, which are very critical and important, and then begin to understand any type of development that may be associated to those corridors as well. Not only within the rural east market area, but also in the adjacent market areas.
Yeah. I think Matt will speak to that when he describes the place types. The idea that there's, it's in a slow area, of course, the rural, even in the WO, but understanding the ways in which development can happen in a very limited manner, but in a very sustainable manner in the rural areas is an important part of this exercise. And then there's one, which I'll direct to you, Alberto, again, but I want to say one thing about it. It says, will objectives and policies continue to exist? And I want to say, of course, and that is part of a comprehensive plan, and we need feedback, and people can help identify those policies and objectives that are needed for their own market areas. But the reason that these sector plans and these place types are being defined is that so often these objectives and policies are very skilled and very pertinent to describing a vision, but it's not painted in a physical form. And what the sectors and the place types and even Orange Code are trying to do is to define to put a vision, even if it's a very overarching vision, to what these objectives and policies can support, which we think will give residents a great level of comfort in actually seeing how that can be mapped and translated, how these objectives and policies are mapped and translated accordingly.
Yeah, and just to add, Marina, to the question, we have recently gone in front of the Board of County Commissioners with a cleanup of our existing policies and goals of the 19 elements of the comprehensive plan. We have recently completed that. The general and a great deal of coordination with other divisions and departments within the county was a very engaging effort to get us to where we were at before we went in front of the board. So I just want to reassure that the comprehensive plan will continue to evaluate each one of those elements, But the strategy here, as we continue to reorganize this Vision 2050 in a much more comprehensive manner, is that those 19 elements will be better consolidated, not necessarily by elements, but by chapters. So if you think of 19 elements today, we're anticipating the association of 9 different chapters where some of these elements will better coexist in this vision 2050 that it's in the works right now, so that they're not isolated and the reference is not as disconnected as it exists today. So a much more better organized structure is anticipated as part of this Vision 2050.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question. Actually, I'm going to answer one more question before I turn it over to Matt again for the description of the place types. But someone is asking us to zoom in on the targeted sector of Lockhart area. And we want to say, we're not doing that now. We're not going to zoom into a sector now. And in fact, we don't even, the purpose of today's presentation is really to describe the sectors and the place types without necessarily zooming into specific areas, because then otherwise people get so focused on, well, what is my land zoned or what is immediately around me, which while we agree is completely important and relevant, we really wanted to give give Matt the opportunity to explain the sectors and explain the place types. And these maps will be released and people will be able to zoom in on them in great detail once they are, once we finish sort of, well, once we internally tweak them, but then they're going to go out to the external, to all the stakeholders, and you will have ample opportunity to look at this. But we're not going to be zooming into areas today, as unfortunately.
And Marina,
sort of.
Just to add, and I think Matt was alluding to that, and I'll let him continue. But for those that are interested in the Lockhart area and what we had been anticipating will be a focus discussion about Lockhart, will happen much more, I think, tomorrow when we discuss the core market area, because the adjacencies between these two blurred boundaries between the core market area and the Northwest market area is the focus area that I think those folks that may be participating today may want to understand a little bit better. We did a soft introduction of that during our first series, a corridor that would be a focus area for that community, and I think we will continue to discuss the specific details, not only tomorrow in more detail, but also as a follow-up focus meetings with those specific stakeholders and residents.
Yeah, so thank you. And I do want to say, of course, as Matt's going to describe the place types, there will inevitably be a zoom in to the area larger than what you've seen right now. So there are other questions, but I'm going to reserve them for after the place types so that we can give Matt a chance to explain those.
Yeah, and as we saw on Monday, there's some questions that get answered with the place types discussion, of course, and we do zoom into some areas. So yeah, I was going to point that out and have some info on on Lockhart and but what we're going to show our first series of how these types work and how they might be mapped. And as Marina described, the mapping, the initial mapping's in progress and will be shared once it's together, and then it'll be tweaked through public participation. So diving into place types, again, we covered sectors first because the sectors help determine which place types are desirable in a given area. Some place types are of a greater density and a greater intensity, and those clearly are not the desire in the rural area, but that's what we're looking for in targeted areas. And others are of a lesser density and intensity. Again, the targeted sector encourages infill growth and permits place types that are higher intensity than the established sector. And the established sector aims to maintain character, permitting lower place type intensity. Again, place type being future land use. But place types are not only about density and intensity. Place types help determine how growth can occur through physical characteristics like heights, but also block structure and the mix of uses, along with density and intensity, the sort of traditional tools. Many place type details are regulated in the zoning code update, Orange Code. We'll discuss that in the next series of town halls. In the comprehensive plan, place types are the future land use categories. They regulate density and mix of uses, the allowable mix of zones from the zoning code, and they're really tightly connected. And they describe the intended character of new development and of existing places. Place types are organized into 4 categories. The urban types, which are applicable within the urban service area. The rural place types, those are applicable outside of the urban service area. Open space place types, these cover natural areas and the county's larger parks. And special place types, they're similar to that special sector. Those are places with those special rules and considerations like universities, industrial districts, theme parks, and so forth. So we'll go in an order to do the simplest things first. Open space types are by far the simplest. Here there's just 2, parks and recreation and natural areas. Both of these you can find really in any sector. Parks and recreation covers larger county parks and recreation facilities. They may be added to any of the sectors in the future, and they may exist there today. These enhance the surrounding area and tend to be located near built-up places most of the time. And then natural areas are places set aside for conservation. The preservation sector is really full of natural areas, but they can also be found in other sectors. Like I said, they're just smaller areas of nature. So those were pretty simple. And we'll look at the rural place types, which are also relatively simple compared to the urban types. So rural place types are divided into 3 categories located within the rural sector. They're all low density or very low density in character, with landscape and regional character preservation as the goal. So you'll see on the right, we have these categories of access and density and landscape. These are just intended to give a quick look comparison to say, hey, the top category of the rural villages and hamlets, which is one type, these are a higher density than a rural settlement, for example. There's a little less landscape, but they've got more access to transportation, and rural lands is really all about the landscape, but there's basically no density or access to transportation. So you can compare these to, say, the urban types, all of which are a higher density than any of these. So rural villages and hamlets, these are walkable places within the rural landscape, surrounded by land in rural use or natural areas. These places are rare, but they provide necessary services and some increased transportation access within the rural landscape. Rural villages and hamlets offer a degree of walkability by clustering development while preserving rural lands around them. Rural settlements are well known. These are the very low density developed areas within the rural landscape. They are generally intended for preservation of their current character. And of course, rural lands are the areas that we think of when we consider most of the rural environment. They have little to no development and are in principally agriculture or pastoral uses. So again, the rural areas are relatively simple, just having 3 types to look at. And the last of the easy ones is the special place types. As I've mentioned, these are just like the special sector. They don't fit into urban or rural categories. They need special rules. Here, there's 3 examples: industrial, institutional, and entertainment place types. But a few others also exist, like airports and utility facilities. So that was quick. But now into the urban place types. These types are the more complex of the place types, and the details of which we'll focus on now to help understand the way that they interact with sectors and how they're intended to organize growth. So the urban place types themselves are further divided into 3 categories: centers, corridors, and neighborhood fabric. Each of those categories has 3 types within them, totaling 9. It may seem like a lot, but if you compare that to current future land use categories, the structure is much more simple and organized, and the goal is to better communicate the vision and expectations for the future. Centers are the most intense of these 3. They're all mixed use types, and they're at the higher end of density compared to other place types. Corridors connect those centers together. They're also mixed use, but at a lower density and intensity than centers. And neighborhood fabric surrounds centers and corridors, which is generally residential in use, along with supportive services like schools. We touch on that a little bit in the questions. So this is a typical diagram to illustrate the structure. Centers are typically located at the intersection of major roads. They're intended to be mixed use and vibrant in the future, places for higher density and the convergence of mobility options, as well as being places for jobs and entertainment. Today, these are mostly shopping centers along major roads, but they will be encouraged to infill with housing, additional non-residential uses, but also civic space together to become more vibrant places. The lowest intensity center is the neighborhood center. These are small, non-residential, and mixed-use areas that may span just a few blocks, or small mixed-use areas where neighborhood compatibility is really important. Many neighborhood centers exist today, and they're intended to be enhanced and encouraged. Single-use neighborhood centers may be supplemented with additional housing, but growth in neighborhood centers is not really a significant intensification over their prior condition. So they're much lower intensity than the other centers. The goal here really is compatibility in scale and activity with surrounding neighborhood fabric. Now on the other end, you get the urban centers and regional centers. We group them together here. The two are the most intense of the place types, and you may associate them more commonly with mixed use and vibrant places. Urban centers are the lower of the urban or regional center. Those buildings are maybe around 4 stories and on a connected street grid, mixing non-residential and residential uses. These are places for entertainment, services, job centers, and places that a good percentage of the population would like to live, particularly younger and older folk, but do not currently exist in any quantity. Now, regional centers are more intensive, akin to downtown, but there's not a whole bunch of them. So we didn't separate them out in this slide because really the goal here is the regional center plan for iDrive for that to become a key destination for the region in the future. Centers concentrate density and intensity to build vibrant places. They're also key nodes along the future transit network, the type of development that transit needs to be efficient. They're also ideal environments for multiple mobility solutions, also micromobility. So next you have the corridors. Corridors connect centers. They're generally along transportation routes, providing housing and business with transit access. Corridors are mixed use, typically adding residential uses to already commercial areas, but their intensity and density is much lower than centers. Generally being adjacent to neighborhood fabric, corridors must transition in intensity towards the surrounding neighborhoods. That's also something that the Orange Code update helps to facilitate as well. So of the corridors, there's the Main Street corridor to look at first. Main Street corridors, they exist throughout the county. They're the lowest intensity of the bunch. They're low in scale and intensity. They may be single use today, but transition to low intensity mixed use in the future is possible. These corridors provide important services to nearby residents, but many could benefit from street trees. Clearly this picture is missing a bike rack, and also with the code that encourages them to flourish. Main Street corridors are areas where the treatment of the street itself requires particular attention. In the comprehensive plan, this is a key component to indicate to the State Department of Transportation that this future land use is aimed at walkable and bikeable places, a key component of that department's context-sensitive approach. That's been built in the Orange Code update as well, and we'll discuss that in the next town hall series. But this place type, this corridor place type, and these place types in general are really tied in closely to what DOT is doing and what the Orange Code update is doing as well. So they're really coordinated between the three. Next to the transit corridors, these are located along existing and future transit routes. Because these have greater transit access, they're intended to be higher density relatively and intensity, connecting people with high quality transit. Lower density than centers, but higher than the neighborhoods that surround them. These are mixed use areas, but the extent of non-residential use would vary based on the market demand. Most non-residential towards the centers, some still on the corridors. The primary goal of transit corridors is to increase the population living along premium transit routes, to increase ridership and reduce future traffic impacts associated with population growth. Centers, of course, play a role in this as well in the transportation system. And then finally, there's suburban corridors. These are located along major arterials that will remain car dependent in the future. Suburban corridors may be intensified with mixed use and they may be beautified, but the relationship to the major roadways requires a special consideration with respect to zoning and land use. For instance, without on-street parking, it's not reasonable to require buildings be located very close to the street, but conditions such as this in the image may be viable. Now, the remaining urban place types are neighborhood fabric. This makes up nearly all the established sector and much of the targeted sector. Neighborhood fabric is principally residential, along with a few supportive services. The lowest intensity is suburban neighborhood fabric. This is located in the established sector and covers nearly all of the sector. You should be familiar with this type, the goals of which are to generally retain the existing character. We discussed that in the Q&A. Suburban neighborhood fabric is really entirely single family residential, but also can have schools and religious facilities, clubhouses, and those uses that are commonly found in this environment today. Next is the suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. Also in the established sector, these are areas where single family townhomes and multifamily housing are mixed together today. Like the prior type, these are targeted for preservation of character. When mapped in the targeted sector, though, this is intended to diversify the area with additional missing middle housing types, as has previously been discussed concerning naturally affordable housing. Suburban mixed neighborhood fabric is found where these types mix in close proximity today, and in some areas as a buffer between higher intensity centers and the suburban neighborhood fabric. The last place type, finally, is the traditional neighborhood fabric. This is the highest intensity of neighborhood fabric, which is still not nearly as intense as a corridor or a center. These areas mix many housing types together into a tapestry of walkable blocks and open spaces. Traditional neighborhood fabrics include schools and similar uses as others, as well as very small corner stores and cafes. The principal goal of traditional neighborhood fabric is to provide a wide range of housing options in a walkable structure of blocks that's located near centers and corridors. So the prior slides demonstrate the intent of place types as the new future land use categories. Now we'll look at how they can be applied to real places with a few examples. First, let's look at a very clear example that demonstrates urban place type categories of center, corridor, and neighborhood fabric. We actually use this one in other market areas because it's very clear in the way that it demonstrates the intent of urban place types. But a good thing it happens to be in the Northwest market area. This is where East Cimarron connects with the OBT. Some of this area is incorporated, but at the moment we're going to ignore the incorporated areas for the clarity of the diagram to demonstrate the way that these types are intended to be used. So this area happens to demonstrate a lot of common characteristics that you find elsewhere. There's automobile-oriented commercial along the larger roads, Cimarron and OBT, along with larger shopping centers at major intersections. Beyond the commercial properties, there's a wide range of housing, some large and small lot single family, some townhomes, and some multifamily. Here's a sector map for this area. It's pretty simple, 2 sectors, right? When you zoom in to this scale, it's usually not that complicated, but we'll look at a slightly more complicated version later. Here, most properties are in the established sector, with the targeted sector along the major roadways, plus a small node of existing commercial north on Thompson. So here's a look at the boundary between the targeted and established sectors on the aerial backdrop. The targeted sector follows mostly the commercial properties along major roadways like Cimarron and OBT, and single-family neighborhoods beyond are in the established sector. So we put a thicker black line, if you can see that, around the corridor in the targeted sector. So when we look at place types here, you can see how they work with the sector. So this is a map of place types as they might apply to this area. Within the targeted sector are the higher growth types, centers, corridors, and traditional neighborhood fabric. In the established sector are the low growth types, suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. These are the centers. Two of these we might categorize as urban centers. These are areas of commercial and multifamily that are large enough to develop a structure of blocks and civic spaces and can accommodate both mixed use and higher intensity residential infill. Of course, a lot of this is not in the county, it's in incorporated places. So let's just not consider that at the moment, just for the diagram. So these centers are in the targeted sector. The neighborhood center to the north, on the other hand, is much smaller. This can accommodate a small amount of mixed use infill, but needs to retain compatibility with the surrounding neighborhood fabric. So this may be a neighborhood center. Here are the corridors. These are commercial and multifamily properties that are located along major roadways. Some are in an OBT, of course, but they're not included in the centers. So the centers are those open spots in between them. In this case, both Summerlin and OBT are planned for future transit improvements, so they're considered transit corridors. And transit corridors encourage more residential and mixed-use infill than suburban and Main Street corridors. Most of the examples today have transit corridors. In the core, you actually see a little more of the mix between different corridors, so we'll look at those in the next meeting. So the remaining area is all neighborhood fabric. It's really the majority of the area. The neighborhood fabric's divided into suburban in the light yellow, suburban mixed in light orange, and traditional in dark orange. These are differentiated by density, where the suburban neighborhood fabric is the lowest density and traditional neighborhood fabric is the higher of the three. All, of course, again, lower than the corridors and centers. When we look back at the place type map, this area clearly demonstrates the centers and corridors framework that we discussed earlier. The framework is also important as we look to encourage more efficient transit functionality and increased ridership. Transit functions best where there are nodes of mixed-use activity in the centers that are connected in lines, which also lend energy to ridership along the corridors. Now here's what the map looks like when we pull out the incorporated areas. Now it's much more difficult to discern what the pattern is, but we wanted to look at it first so the pattern could be clear. The sector and place type map is designed here with consideration for the incorporated areas around them, then removed from the map in the actual comp plan documents. The sector maps, as we mentioned, the place type maps that we're looking at right now, they're in draft. They'll be shared on the Vision 2050 website in the coming months. And there will be opportunities for input on those. So let's look at another example. Since most of unincorporated land in the market area falls within the preserved and rural sectors, let's take a look at a more rural example. Here's the southern edge of Tangerine with Lake Ola at the top of the map. Because this is the rural sector, though, this example will be very simple. Here's a sector map. Almost all of the area falls within the rural sector. Just at the bottom right is a small corner of intended sector, which carries over a previous designation that's existed prior to now. But in general, this area is entirely in the rural sector. So here's the place type assignment. Pretty simple. There are two rural settlements defined by the established boundaries that exist today. And rural lands occupy the western extent of the area. Lake Carlton is identified as a natural area. Here, while Lake Ola is within the natural settlement at present, maybe that's something that gets mapped as a natural area. Or if it's not, it still remains preserved through other policies in the comprehensive plan and also in the zoning code. So there's a lot. Sometimes there's a few options for how you can sort of handle things, and we're working on that as these maps are further developed. Since we looked at the types in prior examples, I just thought we should do the same here, if only to have more than 3 slides on the example, because it's really so simple. And again, both of these are oriented towards preservation of existing character, the rural settlements and the rural lands. Now, because the rural example was exceedingly easy, let's take a look at a different type of example. This is Taft to the west of the Orlando airport, just to see how this might play out in another situation. This area includes a large amount of housing in a traditional grid of streets, but the housing is surrounded by a large amount of industrial, with the airport just to the east and the 528 Turnpike intersection here just to the west. The sector map illustrates this condition pretty clearly, with the special sector in purple occupying most of the map. That's the industrial areas. The established sector covers nearly all of the existing neighborhood fabric. However, the targeted sector here is assigned to properties between the existing neighborhood fabric along and near Orange Ave. If this wasn't in targeted and we just did a translation, a lot of that stuff is industrial, and it actually kind of tears the neighborhood apart. So here the idea is to apply the targeted sector to stitch the neighborhood fabric together by transitioning the area near and around Orange Ave from industrial use to become a neighborhood center and supportive housing for the neighborhood. So here's the aerial with the black line boundary of the targeted sector. You can see here that most industrial properties in the center are intended to change. So the targeted sector, most of that stuff is currently in industrial use. But the other surrounding areas that are not in the targeted sector are likely to remain as they are in industrial and stay in the special sector. So here's a map of the place types for this area, again pointing out the outline of the targeted sector surrounding the new center. Within the targeted sector are the higher growth types, the centers, the traditional neighborhood fabric. In the established sector are the lower growth types, suburban and mixed use neighborhood and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. There's also the corridor, which you'll see, and that runs along Orange Ave, sort of regardless in this case of the sector. So here's a center, a neighborhood center in this case suggested due to the scale and extent. This can accommodate a small amount of mixed use infill, but really given its place in between two neighborhoods, it should aim to remain compatible with the surrounding neighborhood fabric, thus the neighborhood center versus an urban center. And here's the corridors, as I mentioned. We're looking at transit corridors, and the transit corridor sort of takes precedent over other things in order to increase ridership on transit. So properties along this route on Orange Ave are part of the transit corridor. And the special sector area remains with the industrial pace type as is. The remaining area is neighborhood fabric, the deeper orange traditional neighborhood fabric, and that's within the targeted sector. Again, that's a greater mix of different types of housing at a higher intensity than the suburban mixed and suburban neighborhood fabric, but not as high as the center or corridor. The remaining is mostly suburban mixed neighborhood fabric with a little suburban fabric at the very, very edge of things. So this is the composite map with the incorporated areas identified. Unlike previously, the first example, because the incorporated area would all be sort of special sector here, you didn't really have to map the place types. However, you may notice that piece of neighborhood that comes up near the suburban fabric, that light yellow, that is also suburban fabric. So that does influence the application of the place type there. But the goal is to use these types to not just do land use on the parcel by parcel basis, but to look at the larger area and say, where are our centers and what are the components of our neighborhoods and corridors, so that the future land use directs a vision for the way that that growth will occur and sort of fill out into areas that are supportive of surrounding areas. So that's really it on the place types for today. Again, a lot of information for these as it is as it's worked out in the next couple months will be posted onto the Vision 2050 website. So be sure to check out that site for more information as it comes along. We'll also be reviewing more examples in different market areas throughout the next 4 meetings that we have in this series of town halls. And then the next set of town halls, we'll jump into Orange Code, the zoning code update, and talk about how it connects with comprehensive plan policies. But now let's just take some time to cover questions and clarifications from the Q&A and comments, or anything that the county or consultant team feels should be elaborated upon. Marina?
So Matt, would you mind going to your Taft example, the past 2 slides, and maybe starting with the one that identified, the sectors. Oh, well, this is a good, well, no, go back one more. Yeah, this one.
Oh, okay, 1 second.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm anticipating this would be a kind of a question that you would have, and that is, why does the neighborhood center encroach more on the east side into a neighborhood? Like, why isn't that line straight down? Like, there's those 2 little red blocks, and I know it sounds like it's very very specific, but those are the kind of questions I would imagine people would ask. Like, how did you define the edges of the urban center, and aligned with that, how did you define what would be in suburban mixed fabric and traditional fabric? Maybe you can speak to that.
Sure. And I think that bump is a good thing to point out, because right now a lot of the land uses are based on a translation from current land uses to how they would fit into these types of land uses based on what sector they're in. So there's this like interplay between the existing future land use and the place types and sectors, and then we have to look more specifically and say, does that make sense, and can that change, and in which direction does it change? And that's why the maps are work in progress, and those sorts of specifics are done over the next few months, where we do a first pass. There's a few rules that we have for how to translate the existing into the future, and really the process starts with the centers, and then moves on to the corridors, and then moves on to the fabric, and then we need to zoom in and look at the details.
Matt, this is Marcus. Marina, this is Marcus. I also would like to add that what is not shown here, because at this point we don't have an immediate plan, but we would anticipate that perhaps in the future we would have a TOD station where the rail line goes, that straight line goes north and south, and where Orange is kind of curving around the rail station. So if that is the case, and if we are extending the TOD planning area, we would anticipate that area might change. That it could get a little bit larger. It could also encompass a little bit more of the all of the areas surrounding the station. So as Matt said, this is a preliminary draft. We're working toward through the delineation of these areas, and we shouldn't expect that this is necessarily the final area.
No, that's fine, but I think this is such a good example of how the maps will wiggle a little bit and will form around large parcels that may have been commercial, or that butt up against more established neighborhoods, and thinking through what those transitions look like. So it's it was a good clarification, but it's also an understanding of what these place types look like. So I have another question for you, Matt, but I want you to go back first and answer the second part of my original question, which was, how did you define, or how did you delineate traditional fabric from the suburban mixed fabric?
Well, here the traditional fabric is all in the targeted sector. So all of that is essentially land that is not. I don't think any of that's currently in residential use. Now, Marcus can elaborate on that, but it happened to be anything that was within the established sector that was slightly outside of the area of the center. That's the traditional fabric. Now, in the established sector, you have the suburban mixed, covering a lot of the land, because you have housing of different types and a variety of lot sizes, which is what the suburban mix is. And then only further out do you have some more regular, larger lot single family and that's what has the regular suburban neighborhood fabric.
Yeah,
Great.
the key thing here is from understanding the existing pattern, the difference between that traditional fabric and the red, which is the center, to where it goes more towards the what we call suburban mix, is the targeted zone. So we are targeting those areas that are directly relating to the transportation corridors, right? So that's why you have Orange Avenue and the Sunrail line. And as it goes farther and as it becomes more of an established single family residential with no offices or no mix of uses, that's when you change that color from traditional to mixed suburban. And the difference for those in the future development is one of density, is that as you go towards the reds, the density of future development might potentially increase. And as I said before, once we if in the future we have a potentially a transit station there, either BRT or a future Sunrail station, then that would change even more towards the red areas.
So is it fair to say, and I'm thinking that it would be really good to see the sectors and then the place types included in each sector, but would it be helpful to say that or is it fair to say that generally the traditional fabric is in the targeted sectors and the suburban mixed use is in the established sectors?
That is exactly the case.
Okay.
It is. It was written, but yeah, we didn't specify it in that way. But also, it's not suburban mixed use; it's suburban mixed neighborhood fabric because it's not mixed use. It's a mixture of housing types, but they're all residential.
Got it. You're right. It's a good distinction. So, in line with that, Matt, the way the sectors accommodate place types, the place types are intended to encourage different building types, right? So that it's not an entirely a huge zone of just one kind of building type, which we're trying to get away from. So maybe you can speak to how these place types are intended to encourage a diversity of sometimes residential types, and in other cases, a diversity of residential and use types.
Certainly, and of course, we'll get into this in great detail in the next series. But I think that works well with something that I wanted to point out, which is, if you look at, say, a current future land use map, it's going to look more like a sprinkle. It's like confetti sprinkles. There's all sorts of different uses next to each other and so forth. And don't worry, this will be relevant to your question. But if you look at the map here, the more intense the red, the orange, and to the lighter yellow is describing intensity. So just on a quick look, we can say, clearly I know where intensity is intended to be and which areas are intended to be less intense. Now, intensity has a lot of characteristics. We like to use that term at first rather than just density, because density is one characteristic of intensity. You also have, the mixture between residential and non-residential uses, how many people are walking. Places that are more intense with people have more people walking and more people biking, more different modes of transportation. And so by looking at our future land use in terms of intensity, now we can say, well, this center is a place of activity that has people in multiple modes of transportation, a lot of people on foot. And in this case, it happens to be a mixture of uses and residential. So now you have to look at some considerations for transportation and what are your other rules and policies around transit access, right? So this gives us those nodes to be able to understand that. Now, when you get to, say, the traditional fabric and the suburban mixed fabric and so forth, the place types, they allocate a certain amount of different transect zones, of different zones in Orange Code. And we'll look, I don't want to get into too much detail there, but those zones are arranged from greater intensity to lesser intensity. And so they mix. In one zone, you may be able to have multifamily and townhouses and small lot single family. But in a different zone, you might only be able to have the large lot single family. And so the types mix those zones together in this fabric of intensity. So let's look at the traditional neighborhood fabric here. That would have a few zones that allow a whole range of building types, most of which are pretty hard to do today. But there's a significant demand for them. So here in these areas where we want growth to occur, it needs to be supportive of this transit area. You aim to have this greater mix of building types. And I know that Alberto talked about the building types in the prior series, but really getting into cottage clusters and townhomes and small and medium multifamily that mix all together. But that would happen in that traditional neighborhood fabric by zoning, but not in the suburban neighborhood fabric. So I don't know if that helped clarify that or not. I mean, it's complex when you get into the zoning piece.
That's helpful. Now a question on the rural place types, because you mentioned that the rural hamlet and village may add a little more density, but I think it's important to distinguish the idea of the villages and the hamlets from the rural settlements. So the rural settlements is what people know. They're the large lot development in the rural areas. The idea of the villages and the hamlet is to maybe have a slightly greater density in a more compact manner and then preserve a lot more open space around it. And it is a new typology, but it's in the part of the country that I am in, for example, it's which is the DC area. It's been an effective way in which these rural villages has proven to be an effective way to cluster. And clustering is a really nice way to try encourage the preservation of open space, and not necessarily to plat out everything at 1 to 5 acres or 1 to 10 acres. So this is a conversation we're going to really want to have with people to see if you all are amenable to this kind of development, if it makes sense. We'll show examples of what that looks like, but maybe you can, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Matt, and or Alberto or Olan or anyone else.
Well, I'll add quickly that there are a lot of examples up and down the east coast of Florida of counties that have adopted different policies around this. Some have been more successful and some less successful. So there's a history in the area. Just head to the east and any of the counties directly adjacent have had experience with managing rural growth and clustering. The Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council had done some of that work in a number of the counties, and some of them just sort of let growth go in the rural areas, like Palm Beach County, and that's not the preferable way, I would think, to handle it. But other counties really focused on this idea of villages and hamlets and have been successful doing so.
Great, thank you. I'm going to now shoot some questions over to Alberto. The first one is, will the county stabilize the urban service area for the next 30 years to achieve the intentions of this plan?
Yeah, so I believe the Vision 2050 is strengthening where via the sectors themselves where growth should be happening by the targeted sector and even the intended sectors. There's plans, policies, and specifics of those sectors as to where growth should be guided towards. I believe that takes the pressure of the 2010-2030 comprehensive plan and delineation of the urban service area, where the need to continue to expand it because of different applications gets minimized quite a bit. So I believe through the mechanism and the structure that we have right now, as part of this Vision 2050, it will continue to strengthen predictability and focus and guide growth where it's intended right now.
Thank you. I have another one for you, Alberto, which is an interesting question. With a targeted area, changing land use is easier in an area that has no HOA, because some that have HOAs tend to be static in their design. So how will the county attempt to create a new overlay to allow HOAs to evolve for future needs? And maybe I'm thinking of an example like Horizon West. Like how would a place that's already permitted, how could a place like that evolve to meet the goals of this comprehensive plan?
Yeah, just so remember, Horizon West is in the intended, and it has its own set of policies and its own code. The communities and neighborhoods, even though they continue to build within the boundary of that original sector plan in the county, in the state, actually the first one in the state, would continue to have that level of predictability that carries with all the policies. And the code that implement those policies. The actual HOA situation, it needs to be clearly stated that those the specifics that the CCNRs, the way that they are governed today, they're private agreements within the residents themselves, and the county is not intending to change or modify those specific conditions within each one of those neighborhoods. However, I believe by strengthening the definition of how Orange County will continue to grow within this particular sectors, and they understand opportunities to maybe evolve and modify their own conditions, I believe that will lend itself. But this plan will not intend to get any layer of involvement in a private agreement.
It's interesting, we are in a private development right now. Our office is one planned by DPZ, but we are in the process of updating. Every 10 years or so, we update the code to reflect the goals of the community, but also to reflect the goals of the greater area. So it doesn't, even if there is a CCNR in place, it doesn't mean that those can't evolve as well, as you mentioned. Okay, here's another question for you, Alberto, which I think everybody has a keen interest in, is how will the public now be involved in the development of this plan?
Yeah, so the public has been involved since September when this effort was kicked off. We had a very robust, if you would, website where a lot of the introduction of this initiative is very well described via some videos and the literature that's embedded in that website, so people can visit. It's organic. It's going to continue to evolve over time. We have specific surveys that are part of the web page, and some that are already established and some that are being created right now. 2 more that are very specific to the topics of the second town hall series and the third. So we have received quite a bit of comments since September, but as we continue in this journey of the second and third series, and we continue to unveil the different strategies of Vision 2050 and how it's going to be accomplished, we hope that those residents that have been involved, not only on the first series, but all along, continue to participate. None of what you're seeing today in terms of specific maps are carved in stone. We're going to continue to take into very careful consideration all of the comments and concerns. That's why the residents are here. They're forming part of this vision, and we need their participation in order to complete it. So the residents have definitely been involved, and they will continue to be involved for the long run.
Thank you. Here's it's a comment more than a question, but Will there be a method for holding the county commissioners accountable in approving projects not in keeping with the FLU or the future land use? How will you keep special exceptions from becoming a way of developers being able to do what they want? In our Claracona rural settlement, this has led to runaway development. A concern that I'm sure, we hear in every community.
Yeah, so I'm glad the question is very community specific. And Clarcona, with the history that it has, I believe that from the get-go of this 2050 vision plan, we internally and with the collaboration of the different comments that we have gathered all along, is that we were going to set aside the specifics of each one of the 22 rural settlements that we have already well established in Orange County. We have policies in the current comprehensive plan that make the statement of them not being expanded, them not being modified, and those specific rural settlements being very, very much kept with very predictable results in terms of the densities and intensities. There is absolutely no intention with Vision 2050 to make any modification to those 22 rural settlements in terms of the policies themselves. They become a place type of their own, actually, and they will carry the existing policies that are existing today in the comprehensive plan. So the idea here is not to make any unpredictable results to the existing character of those neighborhoods and communities. And it's really to strengthen, if there are any weaknesses at all, we would like to make that clear as part of this process.
And Matt or Marcos, these rural settlements are essentially either mapped as the established sector or even the preserve sector, or is it mostly established? Because preserve is natural areas.
They're in rural. They're in the rural sector. Because they're not intended for any growth of any significant amount. But I would also clarify on the first part of the question that there is certainly a goal here by moving from a parcel by parcel land use to a larger area picture of what land use means to help direct good future decision making in terms of what type of development should be in which locations, rather than the sprinkles where you don't have a lot of clarity in terms of why a certain land use should be here or there. That these are a series of very clear goals in terms of where land uses occur.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, to piggyback to what you just said, Matt, and what Alberto said. One of the aims of the Orange Code is to really create a predictability of form, so that people get comfortable with the kind of the development and some assurances that the development that surrounds them or is adjacent to them is in keeping with the character of the area. And when there is a transition, those transitions are managed in a manageable manner.
In a careful way.
In a careful way, there you go. So one other question for you, Alberto, related to process. People have been taking surveys, they're attending town hall meetings, but what will be other avenues for residents to share specific recommendations to the comprehensive plan?
So, of course, we are in this open forum right now. We hope that we can continue to record your responses, not only by going to the web page, but there are specific phone numbers embedded in the web page that you can call, or you can always send us your note to the planning division in the county with any particular comment that you may have or concern, and questions will be addressed in that manner as well. We also will have specific focus meetings that are already being defined right now of community engagement, where residents can discuss specific character of their communities we're meeting with the development community as a follow-up as well to let them know how this, clarify any questions related to process in the future of how some of these complaint applications for amendments even may be targeted in terms of any specific modifications that may need to happen between now and adoption. So we'll have transmittal public hearings, we'll have adoption public hearings, and hopefully before we get to that point, there's going to be quite a bit more public participation opportunities.
Thank you. There's another question on Pine Castle, but that's in the that's not for this market area, so we're not going to spend time talking about Pine Castle, unfortunately, today. But it is part of the redevelopment. There is a plan for the redevelopment of it, since it is one of the TODs. And that leads me to my next question for Matt, which really has to do with, one of the goals of this plan is to really do a better job of aligning transportation planning and land use. And maybe you can spend a little bit of time describing how the sectors and place types are aligned to planned or future transportation improvements.
Yeah, oh, great. There's two levels to that. One is what I had mentioned in terms of the centers and the corridors, and it wasn't so obvious in this market area, but it's obvious in other market areas where the targeted sector aligns itself along corridors and in places that are intended for future transportation investments. When those are determined, but there's transit routes intended for future transportation, and those help define where the targeted sector occurs, thus encouraging development and enabling development. We should talk about the enabling side too, but enabling development to occur along those transportation corridors. But that's not the only piece of it. That's really sort of aligning the future land use with the transportation that's planned. But then there's also the format of what development looks like. So if you have infill at a shopping center, for example, that's at the intersection of major roadways that has transit, how's that going to function? And so the goal here of the place type, let's say that becomes an urban center, is to be as efficient as possible in mixing housing and jobs and businesses together in a walkable environment, ideally connected to the neighborhoods surrounding, though that's not always possible, such that there are more options than just the premium transit or the bus, but also making it easier to walk and bike and use whatever emerging mobility technologies are available. Now, it's really corridor based in that manner, but also the traditional neighborhood fabric is aimed at that. And yet beyond, when we get into the Orange Code update, a lot of walkability is built into the standards set for development within the code. So even if we're talking about a small infill development somewhere, that would be built on the framework of blocks with accessible open space that people can walk to. So using as many opportunities to provide alternatives to just automobility, but other modes. Now, that's one side of the picture. The other side of the picture is the character of the roadways and how does the design of roadways work with the land uses along them. Now, we're super lucky to be doing this right now because thankfully Florida DOT has been doing a better job year after year in their standards, and we've been investigating these in quite a lot of detail as we're working on the Orange Code update. And I just read the other day in their newest guide on context sensitive streets that their goal is to have they've set up a classification system for for the character of different areas that's based on the same system that we're using within the Orange Code update. So there's a direct translation between those two systems, and that classification is based on essentially the intensity of use from a mixed use walkability standpoint to ensure that roadways take context into account. Now, how is context determined? Right now, they haven't mapped all the context. However, the way that they intend to map it at present is to follow comprehensive plan policies that establish predictable land uses in a mixed use format, as well as zoning code standards that reinforce them. So essentially what we're doing now between the sectors and place types and the Orange Code update fits exactly into their goals, such that the standards that are applied to roads from the state level to the county level actually work for pedestrians and bikes and not only cars. Of course, supportive of cars, but they've really broadened that out. And so all of this is a direct connection between land use and transportation from the comprehensive plan down to the code.
That's great. In fact, my next question to you had to do exactly with FDOT's new classification system. So you roll that into one, which is good. And one of my last questions it's either for you, Matt, or for the county to answer, but the 700,000 people anticipated to come here, is there a correlation between the scenarios of growth in each area and the anticipated growth generally for the different market areas and where people are being directed? Or is it just really looking at the form and saying, this is where it makes sense to see development happen, and this is where we're going to sort of encourage growth?
Just a general reference, Marina, I think that we would continue to anticipate about just north of about 80% of those 700,000 people for the next 30 years to continue to take place in the core, the south and the southwest market area. And as we continue to better understand the landscape, if you would, of Orange County, those particular market areas are contain the majority of the percentage of the targeted sector, where, as described today, represent quite a bit of opportunity for infill, as the majority of that land, and I say the majority because, well, actually it's about half and half, about 50% of that land is either undeveloped and underdeveloped. And there's quite a bit of opportunity for growth to continue to happen. And as you know, those areas that are going to carry urbanism and higher levels of connectivity and higher levels of densities and intensities will continue to taper the adjacencies of other sectors that are abutting that particular targeted sector. So in terms of the 700,000 people, I anticipate that at the 2% growth a year, we will continue to see infill happen, and provisions will continue to be focusing on the targeted sector.
That makes a lot of sense.
And you know, Marina, when I had said enabling before, it's sort of related, because at present, you know, we want to see infill, especially on these corridors and related to transportation. But at present, that can be very difficult because of the way that the current future land use and zoning are set up. So the goal of aligning future land use and zoning to create predictable outcomes is tied with making it easier to achieve those outcomes through the development process as well.
That's right. That's an important point to make. And a lot of that will be covered in the next series of meetings. That does it for my questions. I don't know if there's any questions that the county staff have, or if any of the commissioners who are attending have any specific questions, because we know this was a very technical presentation, but we're grateful to Matt for having made it as pleasant as possible. But I want to open this up to the panelists here and see if any of them have any additional questions they would like to ask or comments they would want to make. And if not, we'll end this about 10 minutes early, but we would really hope that you would take the survey that's going to be posted on this as soon as we're done talking, and that you encourage your neighbors, your friends, your colleagues to participate to stay involved and to participate in the continued drafting of this comprehensive plan. Tomorrow's meeting will be on the core area for those who are interested.
And just to remind everybody, there is the webpage identified on the screen, and the phone number to call. And if you have any additional questions or comments regarding this process or the specifics of your communities and neighborhoods, please email them to planning@ocfl.net as presented on the screen as well.
For those of you on the Zoom meeting, there'll be a short feedback box that'll pop up, so please hang on for that. And that'll be posted also as a link to social media, but as well on the Vision 2050 website.
And the whole presentation, which was recorded, will also be available for viewing. Well, thank you all for participating. Thank you to the county staff, to Canaan, to DPZ, and to everyone for making this a good session. And I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow.
Thank you, and have a good night, everybody.